iPad wouldn't open. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Good evening. Thank you, Professor Inam al-Haq, for inviting me to deliver tonight's important Ghazali lecture. My thanks to all the faculty and organizers at Elmhurst for making this visit possible. I especially want to thank Chaplain Scott McNaney, President Van Eycken for being here and opening today's conversation and this event, and Professor Inam al-Haq, but also a number of friends from the greater Chicago area who came here this evening and braving the bad weather to make this event a one-off conversation, and hopefully we can explore a number of issues tonight. So the topic is Madrasa, traditional Islam in the modern world. It is quite clear that the idea of Madrasa, which became a dangerous word after 9/11, because the Taliban, who were accused of giving safety and safe harbor to Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda organization in Afghanistan, that the Taliban studied in the Madrasa. And that's how the word Madrasa came into the American lexicon. There was one article by Jessica Stern in Foreign Affairs where she went to go, and before 9/11, she went to an interview a prominent scholar at the Madrasa in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa area, and came back and talked about how dangerous madrasas were and how dangerous this leader was. But obviously she only looked at certain kind of radical madrasas, and 9/11 and that article just completely took the American public by storm to make us all understand that madrasas are dangerous places, and madrasas are terrorism factories. That's how it was articulated. Needless to say that also quite a substantial part of the Muslim community globally, but also in South Asia, especially modern educated Muslim elites, also don't know what the madrasa is. A very good friend of mine, who publishes many of my articles in his journal, and also, invited me to give an important talk in London. We went out for dinner. My book on the madrasa was just published. Over dinner, he told me, all madrasas need to be shut down. They are dangerous places. I said, what do you mean, just shutting the madrasas down? The madrasas serve the poorest communities and provide some kind of religious literacy and some kind of spirituality for the vast masses of India and Pakistan and around the world. So even among Muslims, you're going to find different opinions about madrasas and the value of madrasas and the service madrasas are providing and the future of madrasas. As a 16 and a half year old person of color in South Africa, I attended a colored school. One afternoon, after break, one of my friends said, where were you during break? I said, what's going on? He said, our friend Gabriel brought in a pamphlet that says horrible things about Islam. I said, really? He said, give me. So I spoke to Gabriel. Gabriel gave me the pamphlet. Gabriel was a Jehovah's Witness, and he had very strong things to say about Islam and the Prophet of Islam. And he said things like, that the Prophet Muhammad took his teachings from Jews and Christians. He was an impostor. Islam is not a true religion. Very much along with many similar things that we heard after 9/11. But this was like 40 years ago. And I took the pamphlet. It really shook me. I had no literacy to respond to these charges. I went to my local library, I picked up a book by Sir William Muir, who was a Christian, committed Christian, and his writings about Islam was also more or less along the same line that Gabriel's pamphlet was all about, but it was just a little bit more respectable language, and again created the seeds of doubt. And then I realized that I wanted to become an electronic engineer, but something inside me said, I don't understand what this faith of mine is, Islam, and I want to find an answer. I joined the local Tabligh movement, which is a global Islamic dawah movement, that is, they invite fellow Muslims to become more observant Muslims. I joined them. They gave me some spiritual help and calmed me down, but the questions were still there. With a few other colleagues of mine, whose names you might know, one of them is Farid Ishaq, and we met up in Tabligh, in the Tabligh movement, and I asked him, what are you going to do? And he says, after you matriculate, after you finish high school, he says, I'm going to India to study Islam. I said, that's the thing I also want to do. How do we do this? And finally we end up on the subcontinent. I end up in India, he ends up in Pakistan, and that's how I end up in the madrasa. Now obviously, what is a madrasa is something that I've written about in great detail. But I think important for you to know is that the madrasas in South Asia today are institutions that have not been birthed in South Asia, but they have a longer history in terms of the history of Islam. When you ask Muslims, or you look at Islamic history, where does Islamic education first begin? Most of them will tell you that it begins in a mosque. And so you have mosques that double up as institutions of learning. The Prophet's mosque in Medina is seen as one such place where education takes place, what we would call knowledge of the faith and attending materials like that. But also afterwards, you start seeing bigger mosques being built in North Africa, the Qarawiyyin Mosque that was built somewhere around 857 or 859 in the city of Fez. And the reason the mosque is known as the Mosque of the Qayrawiyyin, that is the people from Qayrawan, is that Qayrawan is nowhere in today's Morocco. Qayrawan is somewhere in today's Tunisia. But a number of people moved to Fez, and they then donated the money for that mosque, and that mosque is known as the Mosque of the people from Qayrawan. And the woman who donated it, her name was Fatima Al-Fihri. And she gave the endowment for the building of that mosque, and was the first mosque university, so to speak. And therefore, mosques are also the other one, the next one that is famous, is Al-Azhar, established in 975. Al-Azhar is known as a congregational mosque. Therefore, it is known as a jami'. Jami' means a congregational mosque, not a jami'ah, which is a university where all kinds of knowledge congregate. So Al-Azhar still today is known as the Mosque of Al-Azhar, but it is a fully fledged university. So later on, after these developments in North Africa, around about the 11th and 12th century, you see that in further east towards Iraq and Iran, special institutions are built by some significant political figures. One name that you might want to remember is Nizam al-Mulk. He was also the patron of the famous Ghazali. And he built several of these madrasas, known as the Nizamiya madrasas, and there a range of disciplines were taught, mainly Islamic theology, Islamic law, and all those disciplines that are related to making you an excellent scholar on Islam, but also they studied philosophy, they studied logic, and ancillary disciplines. We don't have too much detail what else was taught, but these were the main subjects. Now South Asia, that is Mughal in India, also has a very illustrious history of institutions of learning, but we will start the story right here in the modern period, because I think that's where I want to go. In the modern period, there were a number of centers where learning took place: Delhi, Jaunpur, Lahore, and other cities where you could go and study independently with a number of individual scholars. If you want to study Arabic, you go to Jaunpur. You want to study Hadith, you go to Delhi, and so on. But roundabout in the early part of the 18th century, an institution was built, or an institution, a European's mansion was transformed into a teaching institution in Lucknow known as Farangi Mahal. Farangi is the word that is used, a Persian Urdu word that means European or the Frank, and the Frank's mansion was then given to this family known as the Ansari family, and a man by the name of Mullah Nizamuddin started teaching in that institution in Lucknow, which was one of the important centers in the 18th century. A famous scholar by the name of Shibli Normani writes, whoever resides in India and ties the sacramental robes of learning will inevitably head for the Farangi Mahal after he had such a visit to Lucknow. And then he romantically muses and he said, when I paid a visit to the shrine of Mullah Nizamuddin, that is the man who started the institution in Lucknow, the Farangi Mahal one, he's also famous for organizing a syllabus or curriculum to be taught to aspirant theologians in the Madrasa. When I visited the shrine of Mullah Nizamuddin and saw his modest upper story institution, to my utter surprise, he exclaims prayerfully, that is, Nomani says, I saw God is greater than everything. Allahu Akbar, this is India's own Cambridge University. So he waxes romantically and lyrically about this institution that you can imagine how quaint it is, this European's mansion turned into a teaching institution. Now, Mullah Nizamuddin, and the curriculum is named after him, known as the Nizami curriculum. He had a very illustrious father who died in 1692, and this father of his was very much interested in both discursive knowledge, what we call theological knowledge, but also in mystical orientation, in other words, how to heal the soul and how to perfect the soul. And the son and all his descendants and others, they continued this line of combining learning but also spirituality. But I would say that the Farangi Mahal is possibly a very, very important moment in the history of Islam in India, because it sees knowledge as a republic of letters. Knowledge is a republic of letters where knowledge and books and traditions and disciplines that were authored, as Professor Inamul Haq said, that the newest book that he read in the Madrasa was 500 years old. It's around about that time. Scholars from way past, it's like going to a class and reading Ovid and reading Aristotle, reading the classics. So madrasas preserve for Muslims in South Asia at least the Islamic classics, the classical tradition with its own diction, with its language, with its difficult expressions and complicated grammar, but it preserves that and also preserves that literacy, although I must admit that literacy is rapidly declining because it's not as good as it used to be before. But that's how everybody always talks about the past. You know, today people are not as good as the people were before us. Nevertheless, Mullah Nizamuddin dies in 1748. He is proclaimed as the teacher of Hindustan, but he lays the foundation for an organized curriculum, but on a small and an elite basis. You don't get hundreds of people studying there. You get dozens of people studying there. A century later, that is Mullah Nizamuddin, 1748, a little bit more than a century later, in 1866, 1867, about a decade after the Indian uprising against the British, the British call it the mutiny, the Indians call it the First War of Freedom and Emancipation, a number of Muslims were involved in opposition to the British. They were politically active. When they realized that there's no way to politically defeat and militarily defeat the British, they decided, how do we garrison ourselves and how do we preserve ourselves in this environment in which the British goal is to make us into brown people who think like Europeans and think like white. like whites. It's the famous, I'm just paraphrasing the famous line by Lord Macaulay when he said that we want to have brown people but who think like Europeans and in orientation and in spirit. So Qasim Nanotwi is one person, Haji Abid Hussain is another person, and Rashid Ahmad Gangohi is the third person, but especially these three took responsibility. And Qasim Nanotwi is seen as the kind of the spiritual and intellectual spear. Haji Abid Hussain procured the land, and they started a school in a small mosque, Chatta Masjid, and began to teach this syllabus, this Nizami syllabus. And after some time, they built a larger building and continued to grow. And the place they did it is about 100 miles from Delhi in the city of Deoband. Deoband was historically majority Hindu population, but later on more and more Muslims gathered in that place. And today it is the kind of mothership of the Deobandi school in South Asia. Now, the syllabus of the madrasa is from Mullah Nizamuddin's day, was largely, in Mullah Nizamuddin's day, in his first incarnation, was philosophy heavy, logic heavy, very little of Islamic law, very little of Quran translation or Quran interpretation, and just one book on hadith literature. Over time, this syllabus underwent some mutation and transformation. And that is, a century, 2 centuries later, we now see that this syllabus is heavily laden with the study of hadith in its capstone project. But in the run-up to the capstone project, it's all about Islamic law, Islamic theology, Arabic language, grammar, philosophy, rhetoric, poetry, and development of writing skills and so on. But over time it has become what I would say much more focused on knowledge of the tradition, naql, that is, knowledge that has been transmitted over generations, rather than a strong emphasis on rationality that it was in its early incarnation in that syllabus itself. But nevertheless, Deoband and afterwards also another franchise of madrasas known as the Barelvi school and a third franchise known as the Salafi schools also started populating the subcontinent, and after partition, these schools and these madrasas kept on growing in Pakistan, in India, and in Bangladesh. Of the two schools, the Deobandi schools and the madrasas are the most prolific, and they have grown global, they have a massive global reach, and so also the Barelvis. The Deobandis' global reach is made possible by the Tabligh movement. The Tabligh movement, although it is not technically affiliated to any particular interpretation of Islamic theology in South Asia, its founders come from the Deoband family of scholars, not the family of scholars, but from that tradition itself, and therefore it has also had a bigger reach in Europe, in North America, South Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world. So madrasas, what do madrasas do? These madrasas, wherever they are very much standardized in their format. Sometimes the language might change. In Bangladesh, they might be the language of instruction would be Bengali. In India and Pakistan, it would be Urdu. In South India, they would use South Indian languages. In South Africa and other places, they would use Urdu or they would use English. And the same in the United States, where some use English, others use Urdu. Now, what is, in my view, what do madrasas offer? Professor Fazlur Rahman, whom many of you know, who taught and died in 1988 at University of Chicago, someone of a Pakistani background, a brilliant scholar, he argued that any project of Islamic reform must take serious the foundations of Islamic orthodoxy. He says that in his book called Islam. And because he believes that without that foundation of tradition that the madrasas provide, Islamic reform could run shipwreck and run into problems. even though Professor Fazl Rahman himself had many critical observations about the history and development of Islamic thought and of Islamic orthodoxy, and especially Islamic orthodoxy in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in Pakistan and India, he nevertheless believed that this tradition is important, this knowledge tradition. This is precisely what madrasas do, provide Muslims with a deep understanding of their religious tradition in a way that, I don't like to use this word, but in a sense of authenticity. What do I mean by authenticity? In other words, they can boast a very long genealogy of where these materials go to. They can boast of a long line of descent from where they derive this knowledge. And madrasas, as I said, once were a thriving republic of letters. In other words, knowledge and the vibrancy of producing knowledge, rational knowledge, and discussing it in a robust way, was at a time in South Asia a great feature. In my experience, madrasas now have ceased to be a republic of letters and have now become a republic of piety. It's all about inculcating piety at the expense of intellectual growth and intellectual development. And largely, I think it has also become a place of identity formation. Now, as important as identity is to developing your identity, if you develop your identity and you lack the ability to navigate your identity in new times and in new climes, in new conditions and environments, that identity is going to be anachronistic and is going to be deeply problematic. And if there's one thing that I've learned in my years of studying in the madrasas, associating with madrasa communities, is the great difficulty madrasa communities are finding in navigating the modern world. Why is that so? Well, madrasas believe that they are only committed to knowledge that is the knowledge of tradition. So do they study modern science in the madrasas? No. Do they study modern political science, the humanities and anthropology? No. These days, some madrasas have taken on to teaching students civics, English, and computer science. Some madrasas. There are a few madrasas that are in India that are experimenting with giving you high school, madrasa, college, maybe even a business school afterwards, but it's in that way, but it's not an integrated curriculum. It's things that you pick up in parallel, that is Maulana Vastanvi's madrasas that he is now experimenting with. But you know, he's not getting the greatest amount of followers. Deoband and all its satellite madrasas are filled, and daily new madrasas are being built all over India and Pakistan and around the world. So, and when you speak to madrasa communities, as I have done in 2005 when I wrote my book, What is a Madrasa? When you could speak to madrasa leadership and to ask them the question, look, we need new knowledge, modern knowledge, to be part of the conversation of Islam. Their answer is, look, we can hardly teach these subjects properly. And we are not qualified to teach math and science, and we are not. So I said, no, we are not trying to make you into scientists and to mathematicians. You need to have basic math and science, and basic political science, and basic understanding of that. It's as if they don't understand the question. Or maybe they pretend they don't understand the question. There are few institutions who are maybe open to that conversation, but you know, it's not terribly exciting what some people are doing. My own institution, where I graduated from, Nadwatul Ulama, that was founded in 1905, which was supposed to be the middle path between the secular university called Al-Azhar University and Deoband's orthodoxy. Nadwatul Ulama is supposed to be the middle road institution. Every time I go back to Nadwa, Nadwa looks more like Deoband than what Nadwa is supposed to be. So Nadwa has not charted out the new path that was going to combine, as it says in his motto, Al-Jam'u bayn al-Qadim salih wal-Jadid nafi. Nadwa is not doing that. It's not combining the old and the new. It's rather just holding on to the old tradition. So with the result that any kind of crisis globally in India or Pakistan and so on, it's always a crisis of confrontation, not a crisis of conversation. So any kind of hot button theological issue It's always in confrontational terms, not in conversational terms, and hence I believe that that leaves a very bad odor in the air and also leaves a range of publics polarized in these various countries. Now, the other important thing that madrasas do is that, and this is the important thing, it is difficult to explain to you after I just now told you that what madrasas lack. But what madrasas provide is a deep understanding of tradition. What do I mean by tradition? There's two ways that I'm going to explain to you tradition. One is, what we mean by tradition are norms and practices that are handed down over time. But more important are the norms and practices and their interpretations. They're complex interpretations. That is what madrasa traditions teach us. You learn how the Hanafis, the Shafis, the Malikis, the Imamis and the other schools of law and theologies, how they interpreted the Prophet's message, the revelation of God, and the early community. That interpretation is what makes madrasas distinct from other kinds of interpretations and brands of Islam or franchises of Islam. That methodology of interpretation, it's based on an idea that you do your work through apprenticeship. You are there in the companionship with teachers who teach you face to face. They teach you model behavior. They teach you piety. They teach you complex sentences and the hidden wisdom, commentaries, and deep knowledge of that tradition. And it's brilliant. I didn't appreciate it after I graduated, after 6 years in the madrasas. It took me 15 years later, when I now had to go back into my madrasa learning to deal with challenges in South Africa, then I realized, and I still realize today, and after I did my doctoral dissertation, and now that I teach students at Duke and Notre Dame, I now realize how valuable that tradition is. And now I begin to see this complex understanding of Islam that is being handed down to me and to every madrasa student if you did your homework correctly. So that is a very important component, that epistemological apparatus. In other words, that knowledge apparatus. Now most of you are going to say, those of you who are Muslim are going to say, but Islam is easy. It's the mullahs who are making it difficult. No, Islam is easy as a message, one God, Prophet. But the meaning of Islam requires constant work. It requires effort. It requires labor. It requires thinking. It requires soul searching. And that is why you need the tools that the madrasa gives you. It gives you Persian language, Arabic language, Urdu language, multiple Turkish, Ottoman languages that you can dig into the great archives of Islamic thought. So in other words, if you think what the future of madrasa is going to be, these are supposed to be intellectual bastions, knowledge houses, storehouses of knowledge. If the right people come there, do the right kind of work in the right way, Islamic thought and Muslims could be on a very different chart. That is my aspiration, that is my hope. Now I'm sure I'm going to get questions from many of you, but what is the version of the simple Islam? I'm quite happy to take those questions. The other thing is that what is the other role that tradition plays? The other role that tradition plays, tradition provides for you the common sense that must prevail at every moment and time in history as you are dealing with God and His Prophet. That common sense. So think about a cylinder, a long cylinder going back to the Prophet. That cylinder is tradition, provides you the common sense. And in that cylinder are the teachings of the Prophet, the revelation of God, and the opinions and understandings of millions and millions of scholars and teachers over time. That temporal and that common sense that is marked by temporality engages prophecy and revelation over time. Without that knowledge of tradition, in other words, the common sense of the different times, the revelation and prophecy becomes distorted. What do I mean by that? One of the most important things that Muslims in the modern period need to do is to take history seriously and to see how the common sense of Islam worked in the Kufa of the 7th century, in Baghdad in the 9th century, in Egypt of the 10th century, that common sense that engage with the materials that the Prophet of God, Muhammad, on whom be peace and blessings, and the revelation of the Quran was understood by Muslims. Today, because of the loss of this tradition, you have this do-it-yourself version of Islam, this Home Depot version of Islam that begins in the mountains of Tora Bora and destroys buildings in New York, but also destroys tens of thousands of Muslim lives from Iraq to Afghanistan. That DIY version, without tradition, without the guardrails. Tradition are the guardrails of Islamic thought. Now, yes, we can disagree about the tradition. We can disagree. That's the very idea of tradition, that you disagree. And Muslims, good Muslims, that disagree with each other robustly. That's precisely why you need tradition, to show the modalities of disagreement. But that doesn't make that you are false. What it does show that you are different. And differences in the Muslim community is seen as a blessing, as the hadith says. That means that when you have tradition, you have the boldness to understand the revelation and the prophetic dispensation in certain matters, such as norms and values, that you understand that these things are subject to change. I give you a few examples. Examples that Professor Fazl Rahman mentioned, but many other scholars, and some of you might be familiar with that. The Quran is quite clear. When Muslims were fighting wars and having conflicts in the Arabian Peninsula, that the fighters who are fighting, they get a share in the booty, in the spoils of war. They get a share. Each one get a share. Now you need to understand that, and the Quran is clear about it. There are two kinds. One is when the adversary completely surrenders without a war, and that in which the adversary does not surrender, then you have a war, and there are different kind of equations of how the distribution takes place. We won't go into those details. But what then happens is that you need to remember that when you are fighting a war in the Arabian Peninsula, you are fighting getting horses or camels, some skins, some tents that you run over. We're not talking about high value property, right? We're not talking about very, very expensive things. We're thinking subsistence stuff. When Muslims now begin and expanding, Islam expands to Iraq and to Egypt. This is in the time of the second Caliph Umar. These various fighters started rubbing their hands and they said, "Yippee, we are going to become quite rich overnight because we've taken over these territories, we're going to have property." Umar said, "No such thing." Umar said, "No such thing." But they said, "Umar, this is what the Prophet did, this is what the Quran said." Umar said, "No such thing." Umar said, "Let me remind you of another verse of the Quran, that wealth shall not become the monopoly of a few among you." That verse of the Quran is also important, Umar said. And Umar said, "What I'm going to do, I'm going to give all you fighters a stipend, and these property belong to the people who live in Egypt and who live in Iraq. And some of those properties would come over to the conquering authority, but not all the property." Therefore, in that way, Omar had the confidence and he had the understanding and the boldness to understand the spirit of the tradition of Islam. Similarly, for instance, Omar said that in early Islam, in order to bring and win over people who require a certain kind of economic security and they are insecure, that you can give them some economic security, give them some of the zakat money in order to win them over to your side, because you want now to increase your number, because you're a small community, you can entice them with economic security. Omar said, Islam is strong enough now, we don't have to give money to people who are borderline converts to Islam. We don't have to give that anymore. It's a Quranic verse. Where does this come from? That comes from an understanding, a common sense that surrounds your understanding of the Quran. That is what tradition is about. I'll give you one more example. When Sudan became an Islamic state, or when people are talking about Islamic states in the 20th century, the first thing non-Muslims get really worried about is, are they going to give special taxation to non-Muslims, which is known as the Jizya. And I'm surprised that no one looks at Islamic history of how Muslims dealt with the Jizya. Now, if you study in a madrasa, and if you study the books well, you would understand this better. There was a great theologian by the name of Taftazani, who died in the 14th century. He had a commentator, a man by the name of Khayali. He was an Ottoman scholar. And Khayali writes a commentary on Taftazani's work. And I'm not going to go into details, but in this commentary, it comes to the topic of Jizya. And he says, Khayali says, well, this idea of giving a separate tax or taxing non-Muslims in the Islamic Empire called Jizya, which the Quran also mentions, and in fact the Quran is quite harsh in the way it says how the Jizya should be taken from the non-Muslims. Khayali says, this Jizya is similar to that zakat that would be given to borderline non-Muslims. Once Islam is strong enough, you don't need to give them that zakat. Similarly, once Islam is strong enough, we don't need to tax non-Muslims further on for living in our territories, because we have enough resources in order to do the work that we want to do, and because normally you would use the Jizya, he said, in order to do further expansion. Khayali's commentator, who died in 1657, a man by the name of Sialkoti, Abdul Hakim Sialkoti, he argues, he's an Indian scholar, and he says that he makes the case that Jizya was a slightly different case he makes, and he says that Jizya is no longer needed today, and basically he makes the argument that time and purpose determines the efficacy of God's law. And as you know, the Mughals under Akbar abolished the Jizya. Akbar's son and also grandson maintained the same practice. It's only Aurangzeb who afterwards reinstituted the Jizya, but Muslim scholars had a very clear understanding that the Jizya is not a mandatory thing. These issues are worldly and political dimensions of Islamic thought, that if you have a confident set of scholars and they are knowledgeable of tradition, they can educate Muslims in a way that will not result in anachronism and in problematic ways of providing answers from an Islamic perspective. What this shows unquestionably, and that's what madrasas teach you, is the role humans play in interpretation. It is God, it is the Prophet, and the community of interpreters. This community of interpreters is the lifeblood of Islamic thought. Madrasas do still retain some of this literacy, and it needs to be cultivated in a broader manner, but it requires more research, it requires a lot more investment in the resources, and so that we can produce madrasas that return us to a vibrant and effective scholarship, return to a republic of letters. So you can have piety. Piety can also be cultivated, but not at the expense of intellectual excellence. And normally piety and the cultivation of piety, historically it has always been done on an individual basis. You can find yourself a spiritual master, a sheikh, through whom you get spiritual advice and develop yourself. Now, the big question that happens within madrasas, and these debates have now gone global, is the question of reason and rationality. Reason, and more broadly, is also this question of what is knowledge? Who decides what is knowledge? This is the big crisis. In Muslim practice, an engineer, a medical doctor who goes to learn at the best secular universities, that knowledge, Muslims would say, that knowledge is great. But can you use insights in contemporary philosophy, in contemporary metaphysics, anthropology, sociology, to begin to understand your own society and your own history, and base interpretations of Islam based on new knowledge? That's where we have great controls. Majority of madrasa authorities would say, no, that knowledge is not knowledge that is sanctified within an Islamic tradition, it is outsider knowledge, and hence that knowledge can only do damage. When you remind those madrasa communities that the early Muslim theology that you have are all incarnations of Greek philosophy and knowledge of the Indians and other traditions that you have incorporated. They would either remain quiet, or they would say that was taken at a time when Islam was in dominance and that knowledge was made subservient to Islamic goals. My argument would be, why don't you take the knowledge today that is reflective of your own reality and make it subservient to your own goals and your own purposes? So rationality and reason, more broadly, in the pre-modern world, was cosmic related. In other words, when human beings thought about what is rational, what is reasonable, they thought in terms of planetary organization, Plato's ideal world, and a certain kind of idealism where the perfection is up there, and Aristotle's systematic but abstract forms of reasoning. Those were the kinds of reasoning that prevailed in the pre-modern world. Muslims took a great deal of that and also organized the system along with that. The world that we inhabit stresses immanence. In other words, it's things that are here and now. Why? Our rationality is largely driven by technical rationality, driven and derived from our understanding of matter and the order of matter and the order of materiality. We do things, we make things in ways that humanity is unprecedented in ways, and the way and the reach that we can now have in the cosmos because of the capacity that we have developed ourselves, and therefore we have a different understanding of what reason and rationality is. It's a whole different mode of organization of the self, of the community, and the relationality with the world and with history. Now, I think one of the big challenges that Muslims face today, and I think where madrasas can play an important role, is can one have both a knowledge tradition, a rationality that combines transcendence and immanence? Can you hold on to both, that there is a transcendent reality, but there's also an immanent reality? And I think some of the Muslim mystics like Ibn Arabi, Mullah Sadra and others, these philosophers and mystics, have shown us these kinds of possibilities. And therefore I think that, I always go back to someone by the name of Abul Kalam Azad, who became the first Minister of Education in independent India. He was also a great scholar. Azad was grappling with this idea of a new theology, and he was kind of critical about that. But he said that we need to value, before we discover the new, also understand the past better. And maybe in that way we can have both the knowledge of the past, but also this important, what I would call this important, not addendum, but a vital component that reflects our lived reality that must also be part of a knowledge tradition for a vibrant Muslim life. So I think that the madrasas that are based in the West, there are several in the greater Chicago area, there are some in Buffalo, there are some in California, many in the UK, South Africa, and other places. What challenge do I put to those institutions? I think that those institutions are surrounded by the modern knowledge tradition of Europe. The challenge is, can they build that bridge between the old and the new? I do believe it is possible. In a recent experiment with a number of madrasa students, recently graduated madrasa students in India and Pakistan, in a project funded by the John Templeton Foundation, which I led from the University of Notre Dame, known as Madrasa Discourses. We took a number of students for 2 years, educate them for 2.5 hours every week, online education. They also do their own independent gatherings in India and Pakistan. Then we take them for 3 weeks a year, 2 weeks in Kathmandu, 1 week in Qatar, and have intensive meetings bringing a range of scholars to them. It has a transformative effect on those young madrasa graduates. We teach them history, the philosophy of science, and a re-look and revisit of Islamic theology, and it creates an entirely new dynamic. And in fact, it's become, of course it was very controversial in India and Pakistan when we did it. People called us, we are trying to change Islam, we got called all kinds of bad names. My colleagues in India and Pakistan had to bear a great deal of headwinds and criticism. But today, several institutions in Pakistan are now trying to do this madrasa discourses in miniature form, and another university is also thinking of introducing it in India too. So there's great openness to this among those who have experienced that. It's not about changing it, but it's about thinking about Islamic thought in a way that, say, Ghazali or Ibn Rushd or others thought about these issues, thinking about knowledge in a universal way and trying to bring the experience of our lived experience into our interpretation of Islam, into what Islam means for us today, on a whole range of issues of relationships with non-Muslims, to gender relationships, and a whole range of critical questions that we are faced today with the question of what is the Muslim polity going to be like. You know, there was the attempts and crazy attempts to reinstitute the caliphate violently in Iraq and Syria, and a whole range of experiments that are taking place at tremendous cost, at tremendous human cost, at the tremendous cost of Muslim reputation, at the tremendous cost of human lives. And I think the madrasas have a particular role to play to become part of the solution. I'm not saying the madrasas are part of the problem, but some madrasas can be, but that problem can be solved through a conversation. And therefore, this lecture here today was to show and share my experience that a conversation between the tradition and the experience of the present can result in certain understandings of Islam that would be helpful to Muslim communities, not only in this country, but around the world. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.